Welcome, 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 welcome. Two more welcomes to everybody. Welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, professors, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as they can think clearly. We want to provide those perspectives to you unedited and unaltered so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it's our privilege to have Professor Stephen A. Sloman. He's a cognitive scientist at Brown University. One second, let me pull this up here. There we go. I want to get the title bar. Stephen A. Sloman, professor of psychological. Well, let me fix that. He's a professor of cognitive linguistic and psychological sciences. He studies how people think, how we reason, make decisions, and form attitudes and beliefs. Most of the work in my lab involves experiments asking adults to think about events and report their conclusions and preferences. My perspective has been shaped by observing how people respond to political events, by philosophy, and by computational models of how people process information. All very relevant for our discussion. Stephen Sloman received his PhD in psychology from Stanford University in 1990. Completed his postdoctoral research at the University of Michigan. He began teaching at Brown in 1992. Stephen is a cognitive scientist who studies how people think. He has studied how our habits of thought influence the way we see the world, how the different systems that constitute thought interact to produce conclusions, conflict, and conversation, and how our construal of how the world works influences how we evaluate events and decide what actions to take. The focus of his current research is on collective cognition, how we think as a community, very relevant for our discussion, a topic collaborated on in his book with Paul Fernbach, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone. His work has been discussed in The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, Vice, The Financial Times, The Economist, Scientific American, National Geographic, and many more. He's the former editor-in-chief of Cognition, the International Journal of Cognitive Science, and currently on the editorial board of Decision and Psychological Science. This is the famous book, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone, published by the professor and also Philip Fernbach. Humans have built hugely complex societies and technology, but most of us don't even know how a pen or a toilet works. How have we achieved so much despite understanding so little? Cognitive science, Stephen Sloman and Philip Fernbach argue that we survive and thrive despite our mental shortcomings because we live in a rich community of knowledge. The key to our intelligence lies in the people and things around us. We constantly drawing on information as an expertise stored outside of our heads. This is also some of the work that I found the professorate determines health behavior, especially during pandemic. And then we'll get to that in a second. Also, what research tells us about the power of tribe. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's check in, see how well I did. Professor, did I say anything incorrect about your background? Is there something that we need to correct before we get started?
No, I think you got it all right. You fixed Phil's name from Paul to Phil.
Sorry.
Correct?
Yeah, sorry about
that. I think everything is on the money at this point.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks for the kind introduction, in fact.
What is the knowledge illusion? And what is this concept of collective information input? We're not a person on an island, a man alone who just thinks his own thoughts based upon his own individual perspective. We seem to not be as individualistic as we think or come to conclusions all on our own as we think. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So, in fact, I would question your advice to your listeners at the beginning that the best thing for them to do is to make decisions by themselves. Because I don't think we ever do that. I don't think we're capable of doing that. We're always informed by others. So the knowledge illusion is the fact that people think they understand things, how things work, better than in fact they do. This is true of simple artifacts like ballpoint pens and toilets. And it's also true of our understanding of political systems, right? And of political policies. We think we understand what their effects will be. But as soon as we try to explain them, we discover that we know much less than we do. So we ourselves are willing to admit after a little bit of exploration that we don't understand as well as we thought we did, which raises the question, why do we have this illusion of understanding that we can't validate? And the reason, I think, in large part, is because we depend on others for our knowledge. So when we say we know something, often what we mean is that we're members of a community, and it's the community that knows something, right? So do I understand toasters? Well, I think I do because I can use them. But in fact, the actual mechanism by which a toaster works is way above my pay grade. I could never fix my toaster if it broke. It's actually quite a complicated and sophisticated device. And I depend on others for building toasters, for selling toasters, for fixing toasters. Truth is, I even depend on others for cleaning toasters, I'm embarrassed to admit. And this isn't just true of toasters, this is also true of my political view. So there are too many policies out there for me to understand in any depth. And so I depend on my community to let me know what I should think to some degree. Which isn't to say I don't make any decisions. Of course, I make some decisions, but those decisions are largely based on knowledge that's sitting elsewhere outside my head.
So this idea that every voter is an individual who looks at the facts dispassionately and does their own analysis is kind of a it's kind of a fallacy. And the idea that we could separate people from their communities that they live in to develop their political ideologies also doesn't really make sense. People develop their ideas of politics, they develop their ideas of understanding the world based upon the communities that they live in.
Absolutely. Yes. People are clearly not in a position to make to draw sophisticated conclusions about things like, whether vaccines are effective or whether they're safe, or, what the consequences of gun control laws would be, or just about any policy. Each of these things is incredibly complicated, incredibly sophisticated, requires a huge amount of expertise to have any serious understanding of. And so, not only don't we rely only on our own reasoning to come to our attitudes about things, but we couldn't possibly rely on our own reasoning, except perhaps in very narrow areas of specialty, right? When we have very specialized knowledge about things, then we're the authority. But there's only a very small number of issues that we could be in that position about. So this isn't a bad thing necessarily, right? It's just to say, right, we depend on others, and we think with our community, our basic values and our beliefs about how the world works come in large part and sit in large part in the heads of other people. These days, it's not just people, but it's the world generally. So this would include, the internet, say.
Right. Okay. Not just your immediate local community, your community of people that you listen to at large.
So that's an interesting question, right? Like when it comes to climate change, I would say my thought leaders are a little different than when it comes to how my toilet works.
That's a good point. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you may have different clusters of experts in your mind when you're coming up to a conclusion, depending on the topic that you're looking at.
Yeah. And that certainly complicates the analysis a whole lot, but I think it's, a necessary truth. That's right. We have different communities, which is another way of saying that we have different identities, right? And each of those identities, each of the sets of beliefs that are associated with some domain in the world are going to elicit, different groups of people as authorities.
Have we always had this misguided idea that we were dispassionate individual decision makers? And only recently now we're figuring out that's not true. And if so, how did we get this so wrong for so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, it's impossible to really answer, right? Because
Oh no.
you
Okay.
can't,
All right.
it would require traveling back in the past to see how people think.
Fair enough.
It does. I suspect this feeling that all our knowledge and decision making ability emanates from our own personalities is probably more of a modern view than we than uh, we might guess, right? In the sense that first of all, there are collectivist societies out there that see thought as a collective entity. But even if you look back to say the Enlightenment, um, philosophers talked about concepts uh, when the study of epistemology, right, when the study of how people know and what it means to know first developed centuries ago, the first notion of concept was a socially shared entity, right? So when
Okay.
people said, what's the concept of justice? They didn't mean back then, what do I think justice is? The question was, how does my community understand
Oh,
justice?
right.
So there's actually a return now in philosophy to this notion of social epistemology as opposed to individual epistemology. So, when it is that we humans decided that we personally were the arbiters of all things good and bad is a great question. I mean, my guess is there has been some tendency that way forever. And I say that because of our tendency to hero worship, right?
Right.
So
Right.
we talk about like Alexander the Great as the person who conquered, a good chunk of the world a few millennia ago. But of course, he didn't do it alone, right?
Right. Right.
Um, but nevertheless, we kind of house in the individual the power to accomplish things, and that tendency might be a very old one.
I'm wondering this research that you're not the island you think you are. You make decisions based upon the world around you and the community you surround yourself in reality. Strikes me as the kind of revolution that came to after the 2008 financial collapse. So they had the financial collapse in 2008. And the theory was all bankers and investors are rational men. They will only look at the data and make the best decision they can on the data purely analytically. And what they found out is that's just the theory. It's kind of a fantasy. Uh, you put a bunch of data in front of the smartest mathematician and tell him he has to pick a stock price, and if you screw up, you lose $1 billion. He starts digging down into his emotions and starts making an emotional decision, is what they found. And this idea of the rational man was not true. The smartest stock traders with the greatest education and the greatest data will sometimes go, that one.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're finding out that we're not as rational as we thought. We tend to be emotional creatures.
So, can I make 2 points?
Yeah.
I think fundamentally I agree with you, but first of all, so the observation that we're not rational creatures has been around for a long, long time, and in fact, in sort of modern science, it's often traced back to the 50s, the work of Herb Simon, who talked about satisficing. So the idea is that when we're making economic decisions, we don't use all our rational faculties, but we do, but our sorry, it's not that we don't use all our rational faculties, but our rational faculties are themselves limited. So we have a limited number of cognitive resources available to do things. And so a fully rational model is not going to be able to explain human behavior simply because we don't have the tools to deploy all of that rational analysis. But then in the 60s and 70s, judgment and decision-making research really began with the work of Kahneman and Tversky, who said that the problem goes way beyond not having sufficient cognitive resources, but we deploy certain tools very naturally that lead to systematic errors. And so I agree completely that a rational model is not the best way to describe human decision making. That's true of lay people, and bankers and economists are people too. And so you see exactly the same pattern with them. But the second comment that I'd like to make is I don't think the right contrast is between rational versus emotional.
Okay.
Right. So one contrast one could draw is between carefully thinking about something, right? So a deliberative process versus responding in a more seat of the pants way.
Right.
Intuitively. And deliberation versus intuition kind of feels like it's correlated to some degree with rational versus emotional, except it's noteworthy that there are deliberative processes that are very emotional too, right? Like if we deliberate about something and fail to arrive at a conclusion, we'll become very frustrated, or our anger can drive our deliberative processes in a particular way. And moreover, so emotions are everywhere, right? We're constantly guided, motivated by our emotions. And moreover, very careful thought can be systematically incorrect. So it's not necessarily rational, right? And intuitive processes can be correct. They can be rational, especially if we have a lot of expertise in a domain. So I do take issue with this distinction between rational versus emotional. It's the wrong way to think about people, I think.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's why we do the series, to learn better. I appreciate that. I didn't get that. That's a good distinction. Let me ask you about this article. The University of Kansas. Kansas study shows political ideology determines health behavior, especially during pandemic. This finding is especially important to remember in a time of significant political polarization in the United States, wrote Gaina and co-authors Nathaniel Rabb and Stephen Sloman of the Policy Lab at Brown University. What the study shows is political partisanship and ideology seem to be one of the most significant drivers of health behavior when it comes to COVID-19. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines social determinants of health as the conditions in the environment where people are born, live, learn, play, worship, and age that affect the wide range of health outcomes. Because ideology depends upon group affiliation and influences interpersonal relationships, we think it should also be considered a social determinant of health. I believe there's an exact quote from you. I'll look for that. But what was this article about? What was it talking about, the research that you had done with the other professors? And I think I understand, but for the audience, what was the significant thing that you were saying? Like, hey, we used to do it this way. Now we should do it this way when we go forward. What was the big change in thinking you were proposing?
So this is work with Muger, Gianna, and Nat Rabb. And what we did was survey a bunch of people. It's sort of an attempt to find a representative sample of Americans in near the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And we took a bunch of measures. We found out people's level of education and their race and their age and their careers and their professions. And we also looked at their knowledge of COVID and the transmissibility of the coronavirus. So we asked a whole bunch of questions, including questions about their political ideology and who they affiliated with, Democrats or Republicans. And we also asked them what their attitudes were about various COVID mitigation policies, like mask wearing and social distancing, and if I recall correctly, vaccine administration, although a lot of these data were collected before the vaccines were available.
Right, right.
And what we found was that the best predictor of people's attitudes was their political ideology. Even for the most part, even more than their understanding of how COVID transmits.
Wow.
And in subsequent work with an undergrad here at Brown, May Fullerton, actually simultaneous work really, we showed that people's political ideology predicted their attitudes about COVID mitigation even more than their own personal risk and their own perception of their personal risk, right? So like knowing whether someone had some immunodeficiency was less valuable to predict their attitudes towards mask wearing, say, than their political ideology. So we take this as pretty direct evidence for the community of knowledge hypothesis, right? The idea that our attitudes, our views about things are not constructed inside our own heads. We don't reason to them, but rather we inherit them from the people around us. We're kind of channels for our community.
So COVID-19 hits. Maybe I have a medical background. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm really prone to getting it. I have all these comorbidity factors. Maybe I don't. None of that really matters. My opinion is based upon, does my community think that this guy's full of garbage or not? And that really is kind of reflective about what tribe I fit into politically. And that's the number one thing that predicts my opinion about a medical emergency. Is not a health factor. It's not an education factor. It's not a knowledge factor. It's my political tribe factor.
That's it. That's exactly it. I suppose it's kind of sad in this case because our lives depend on it. And indeed, in red states, more people died than in blue states. In nursing homes in red states, more people died than in nursing homes in blue states. So it had this very, serious consequence, I think.
For the study, researchers first conducted a convenience sample survey on social media through the Center for Excellence in Health Communications to underserved populations, followed by a survey with nationally representative sample through Brown's Policy Lab. Respondents were asked about their political, ideological beliefs, as well as their knowledge of COVID-19, attitudes and beliefs related to COVID-19 risk factors, and demographic information. Surveys were conducted in late 2020. 181 papers on the emerging COVID-19 behavioral literature and analyzed results from 44 selected studies that examined ideology's influence on health behaviors. It was shown to be a significant predictor of responses in 79% of the study's estimates and had the largest effect on COVID-19 related behaviors in 39% of these. Seems significant.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely a powerful effect. I mean, it's worth thinking about what exactly is kind of sad about this, right?
Right.
So on one hand, it doesn't bother me that we reach out to other people to understand something as invisible and complicated as a pandemic. I mean, it's driven by this microbe that very few people understand, and at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very poorly understood.
Right.
And so we rely on others to know what to do. And if you get a colonoscopy and you get a positive result, then you're going to rely on others to know what to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? We make use of the people around us.
Right.
That sense, we live in a useful community of knowledge. So the real issue at hand is who it is that we trust. And the debate in society is between whether that community should be driven by scientists or whether it should be driven by other people.
Mm.
And I have my own view on that.
Right.
I see myself as a scientist, and maybe
right.
that's
right.
in part why I have the view, but it's probably also because of my political leanings, right? But that's the question: who are you going to trust? And personally, I think if we're going to deal with these kinds of issues in an effective way, then we just have to trust scientists with the understanding that scientists are fallible, right? Like at the beginning of the pandemic, even the scientists didn't understand the coronavirus. And the understanding how it got transmitted took some time. Understanding the effectiveness of masks took some time. I mean, we were incredibly quick about it. But if you look at other things like climate change, it's an incredibly complicated system, and scientists have been pretty accurate in their predictions, but there have been, huge confidence intervals, lots of uncertainty about what exactly is going to happen. And that's the nature of science. Not only is there lots of uncertainty, but sometimes claims are just wrong. In fact, I would say that's what defines science. The fact that you make claims that could be wrong and that you can demonstrate that they're wrong. So science is fallible. There's no question about it. But nevertheless, it's the best tool we have.
Fair enough. I agree. I think part of the issue with trust might be when we look at COVID-19 and climate change is intentionally misleading people and then not admitting it till later. Fauci lied about the masks, like straight up lied, and he admitted that later, but he didn't admit it at that time. So he lied to the people, and then he goes later on, yeah, I did it. That's not good for trust. I remember Al Gore, the probably inconvenient truth for America, and he said these models show that Mount Kilimanjaro is going to mount by a certain amount of time, and he was massively off on that. And then there was 2,000 emails by scientists that were suppressed. Sometimes we see these experts not do things 100% on the up and up, and that occasionally drives less than complete trust from the public. I've seen. I just got done interviewing somebody, and they were talking about how Denmark had a very good COVID-19 response from their population. However, they did it totally differently than us. They would admit when they made a mistake to their public and promise to do better. We did nothing of the kind in America. And maybe that was why they didn't have a hesitant population that we did. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I agree that the authorities, the WHO and the CDC, made all kinds of communication errors, especially at the beginning. I didn't know that Fauci admitted that he lied. My understanding was that it was more a question of trying to save masks for medical professionals. And I guess that's a kind of deception. So
he admitted that he knew that he wanted to save the masks for medical professionals, so he told the public they wouldn't need them. But then later comes back and tells the public that they do need them. Yeah. That can cause confusion. So now the public's going, hold on, you lied to my face about the masks, but now you're telling me the truth about the masks?
Right.
Which Fauci do I believe?
Yeah.
And then
there's no question that avoiding deception is critical if you want to be trusted, right? Who's going to trust a liar? I couldn't agree more. My sense is that communication professionals, like everybody's a marketer these days, right?
Right.
And they're always playing this game of trying to keep things simple enough for people to understand, while at the same time guiding them in the right direction and maintaining trust. And yeah, often, sometimes, maybe often, they fail at doing all of those things in the best possible way.
I just worry sometimes, the ivory tower syndrome. Also, the phrase from Lord Acton in the 1800s, power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. We tell someone that basically you're the director of everything and everybody has to do what you say. That's a lot of power in one person's head. And then for them to go, well, I'm going to be completely dispassionate and balanced with it. That's a lot to ask for a human being.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I don't think I would personalize the process to that degree. I'm not sure it's about power in that case as much as it is about the attempt to keep things simple enough to understand and persuasive, while dealing with 300 million people and all of those possible reactions. So
Fair. Fair.
I don't have a knockdown argument that it's not about
Yeah.
corruption by power. I just want to
Yeah.
point out there is an alternative explanation, which is they're facing a really, really hard problem, and they don't necessarily solve it in the best possible way.
Absolutely, I agree. And we can see in many different emergencies that the inability to provide correct leadership and communication can have dramatic consequences. What was it? Katrina in New Orleans. That was not well handled or communicated, and it was it was bad. But for the focus of this interview, this article here is related to this article. This one seems more dispassionate. Political ideology determines health behavior. This article says straight up what research tells us about the power of the tribe, and yet it seems to be based upon roughly the same survey. Why is this article called The Power of the Tribe, and how does that relate to this study and survey?
So I don't think I wrote that second article.
Okay,
right? I mean, it looks like,
yeah,
I can't really see. It's tiny on my screen.
Sorry. Yes, this
it looks like someone else wrote it.
Yeah, someone else wrote it. I'll read the quote though. Word on the street and on many newscasts is that the issue is ideological. Is it? Ideology seems to pervade so much these days. There's clearly a split in Americans' confidence in experts. Democrats show more than Republicans. Experts themselves are speaking pretty much with a single voice, with only a few eccentric exceptions. Medical experts recommend avoiding close proximity to strangers, wearing a mask in public, certainly indoors and outdoors, and getting vaccinated. Who is following the advice and who isn't? Why? In two surveys involving almost 1,700 U.S. adults, we asked people whether they take preventative behaviors, mask wearing, and social distancing, and whether they support policies that encourage such behavior. We also asked respondents several questions about their political attitudes, conservative versus liberal, about their own risk from the coronavirus, their understanding of the transmission of the virus, how well they perceive their own understanding of the virus, and some other facts about themselves. We found the best predictor of the behavior and their attitudes was their political leanings. My mistake. You didn't write the article. This other person did.
But I mean, all the facts seem correct. Is there anything you disagree? Maybe you don't like the title.
No, I like the title. I think it gets at the issue is that
all right.
People make decisions based upon their community and their background. And with political polarization, we're watching that a lot of communities are becoming more polarized and very tribal in relation to the others. And so it would seem to make sense that here's a dangerous situation. What do? I don't know. I'll ask my local community. And they're very tribal. So I fall into a kind of a tribal response based upon when really it's a medical health emergency. I should be thinking, what does the science say?
Yeah.
Let me look dispassionately at this. Instead, I'm going, what does my tribe say?
Yeah. Look, today is October 2nd. It was a couple of days ago. I think it was Saturday when Kevin McCarthy decided that he would not shut down the government and it required Democratic votes to prevent that from happening, right?
Yep.
He was. We were very close to having a government shutdown, which would have had all kinds of ill effects, not only for federal employees, but the consequences would have reached out way beyond that. And it was because the Republicans refused to consider compromise, to consider something that Democrats would sign on to. It's another. I mean, this is pervasive, right, in our culture today, and
Yeah.
it worries me.
That's going to be one of the last questions as we wind down. Is Professor, how do we fix this? You have
Yeah.
a solution for us? How do we fix America and make America return to one where we're not as tribal in our decision making and we're more open to what experts say as a country?
So I'm currently writing a book that talks about two two strategies for making decisions. One is making decisions based on consequences, which is kind of the standard way we think about decision making, right? I will choose vanilla ice cream over chocolate because I prefer the taste. That is, it'll have better consequences for my tongue, right? If I choose vanilla. And the alternative, and the way we often make political decisions, is by making those decisions based on sacred values. That is, values that we see as kind of absolute, that apply to our actions. So there are all kinds of, useful, important, sacred values we have, like thou shalt not murder, right?
Right.
Thou shalt not steal. Like
Right.
these are sacred values. The
Good ones.
problem is that when we enter the political domain and we have values like thou shalt not tax, or thou shalt not allow guns on the street, right?
Right.
And then the discourse changes. And instead of talking about what the consequences of our policies are, right, how they're going to change society, instead we talk about what's important to us, what means the most to us, what our absolute criteria are for what's good and not so good. So if we're going to change society, I think it's going to take a real serious cultural revolution. We have to change the nature of the discourse. We have to think in more mechanical terms. We have to be sort of more boring in a way. And that, what we should be arguing about is not who has the best sacred value, who's waving the biggest flag for their community. Right. What we should be talking about are consequences, right? Like, how are we going to achieve things that everybody wants to achieve? And if we did that, not only would we be talking about the thing that matters the most, we probably would have less heated debates, because even though we would disagree, I mean, obviously we would disagree a lot, but we would also appreciate the complexity of what we're talking about. And we would have less hubris.
I agree with that. I don't think we do that anymore.
It's hard. It's really hard, right? It's hard because we don't understand things as well as we think we do.
I think there's a tendency to simplify things beyond how simple they are. And it's just, we got to get the public to understand. It's still kind of complex. I don't know, drop the bar even lower, cartoon the issue so they get it. And then the public gets this not completely accurate understanding of kind of a complex issue. It really just took time to understand it. I remember with the 2008 financial collapse, they were trying to explain it to the public, how they did the derivatives and package it and sold, and people got lost.
Right.
And then they started to dumb it down, and it wasn't fully understood. Did we ever have a time in America, Professor, where we made decisions based upon the consequences and less based upon our sacred values? Was there a time in America where we did that can we return to that? How do we get away from that time if it existed?
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not a historian, and so I'm scared to answer that question
Fair
because
enough. Fair enough.
sure I'll get it wrong.
Fair enough.
I kind of feel like, I mean, here I'll throw something out. Although a real historian, I'm sure will drive a stake through my point. But it seems to me that post World War II, uh, we had a very constructive bent about the world, and there is a sense in which we were working together to achieve ends, and we were talking about those ends, and not talking so much about our sacred values. During the war, of course, there was a very important sacred value: save democracy, save liberty, right? And it actually drove us in this very positive way.
Right.
But to answer your question, that's a period that I would look at if I were an historian. I hope I'm not completely off base there.
No, I like the, you're honest. You're honest. And I think that's part of the question is, okay, we know what the problem is. We know how to fix it. Have we ever fixed this problem before? Was there a time before it was broke? I think those are good questions. I think we can do this. I think we have to. I also think other countries have done it, so it's not impossible for us to do it. But I also think we'd have to have, this is like a generational culture shift where we as Americans have to be reflective on ourselves as American, go, look, we collectively are a little bit too emotional making these decisions. And we collectively, as a culture, whether you're left or right, need to make our decisions more on data and research and not just what my tribe said. That strikes me like teaching people that smoking's bad. It can be done, but it will take some time because it has to happen at the 100 to 200 million person scale. Okay.
Why better than I could have.
Thank you. Okay. Last two questions. These are my favorite too. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person, and they're watching this interview, and they are going, wow, are you kidding me? Politics is the number one decider on if you're going to die from a disease or not. It's not doctors or I'm missing an organ, so I should be more careful. It's politics. Wow. But they're struggling to remember all of the reasonings behind it and fully how that idea was fleshed out. But they go, there was this one thing the professor said. And while I struggle to remember the whole lecture or interview clearly, there's this one idea he said, I can't get out of my head. And it's 5 days after I watched that interview. What is that thought you want people to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after they finish watching this interview?
That thought would be that I don't understand things as well as I think I do. Admitting to themselves that their own knowledge is limited, and therefore they have to depend on others to some degree. So if someone says something that they don't agree with, it's at least worth a thought, because what they know is not rock solid.
That's brilliant. You don't have to answer, but we always ask. Any recommendations? Anybody you know who might be willing to be part of a conversation, honest conversation on political polarization? They could be a academic, they could be an activist, it could be someone down the street, famous author. You don't have to, but we always ask. We try to keep the conversation going.
Let me think about that, and I'll get back to you.
Okay. I want to say thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming out. I really appreciate you educating us about this. I wish I could say that I was happy. I'm more scared now having done this interview. Sorry. That's not good. This is not a good sign.
Well, if we don't admit our fallibilities, then we'll never overcome them.
Perfectly said. Yes. So harsh reality, one we need to pay attention to. Thank you for your time. I hope that more people pay attention to how serious this is based upon this kind of research. And then we get more people talking about how do we get back to a reasonable place.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for taking on this critically important issue.
I appreciate that. I will we'll leave it there. I will email you a copy of the interview shortly, Professor, and I want to say thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming out.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure
Okay.
talking to you.
I'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye.